John Lorimer Worden is actually often known for being commander of the Monitor, but I have to tell you, he did far much more, and the confidence the U.S. Navy had in him as an officer started to expand from the very beginning of the Civil War. You have to realize Warden was considered a scientific officer because he worked at the Washington Observatory. And then he's also known as an executive officer because he was executive officer of the Brooklyn Navy Yard on 2 different ships. So he was in the Navy 24 years. He had just returned from a cruise on the Resede sloop known as the Saratoga. He didn't want to go on the cruise, but when the Navy tells you to go somewhere, you go. So actually, Worden has not a habit, but continuously has different ailments that have caused him difficulty while serving and needing sick leave. In fact, when he returned on the Saratoga in 1860, he immediately asked to go on leave, and then he does. Now, as war clouds start to cover the nation, Worden has recovered, certainly. He has kidney disease. He's got problems with gallbladder, and those are big issues. He's got some stomach disorder, depending on, I guess, the food he's getting to eat. He's been serving in the tropics. So when he is ready to serve, he writes the Secretary of Navy at that time, Isaac Tonsey, that I respectfully request, when a vacancy shall occur at the rendezvous at New York, I may be ordered upon that duty. You have to realize this is before all the states leave the Union, but states are already leaving the Union. And Warden recognizes the need for manpower. He recognized the need that the U.S. Navy is not going to be 93 ships anymore. We're going to have hundreds upon hundreds of warships that are going to enable the Navy to close Confederate ports and actually operate up rivers. So they have to rebuild their Navy, which they do. So Worden wants to be in the thick of the actions. And see, the big problem is states down in the South, like Florida, Florida is one of the early states to leave the Union. They think that every fort belongs to them. It may have been paid by the federal government, but it's here. We gave the land. Those forts are ours. So there's a great deal of clamoring for getting those forts back. And I'll just give you an example. Every time they captured a customs house, they had a big party. Yay, look what we've done, our post office. And many forts fall without any resistance because the U.S. Army had built these forts. It's called the Third System of Coastal Defense. They had built these forts and then kind of left them alone. In case of war, they would be able to come in and, sometimes like Fort McRae, which you can see on the map, actually had one ordnance sergeant to take care of the fort. And so these forts, though, are very, very important because for the Confederates, if you look at Warrington, that is a major Navy yard, the second largest Navy yard in the South. It is critical. It's built several ships. It was founded in 1826 by Lewis Warrington, ergo the name. And so we see that we have to have more forts defending the harbor and, of course, the Navy Yard. Now, the Army first built Fort Barracus. Now, this is the Navy Yard, of course. This is Fort Barracus. I got to tell you, it's a great place to go visit. and they have this great covered way that guides people down to where the water battery happens to be. So Fort Baracus is where most of the soldiers are going to be. There's less than 100. So the big thing is that Captain Slumler, who is in command of all the troops there, and Florida announces his succession. He goes and visits the Navy Yard, and he talks to the commandant of the Navy Yard and says, look, we can't really defend all this place, so I think we should move to Fort Pickens. Now, this is Fort McRae, and here is Fort Pickens. And so Fort Pickens, however, commands the entrance to the harbor. As a result of this, this is where the Unions say, we're going to move all our men. And so the good old Floridians clamor for, you got to give us back the Navy Yard, you got to give us back all these forts. And so the James Armstrong is the commandant of the Warrenton Navy Yard, and he confers with Slumler, and he agrees that, well, I'll try to help you get things onto Pickens. Now, after the succession of the Deep South states, General Braxton Bragg is going to be sent down to Pensacola to try and organize the defenses and trying to starve the Fort Pickens and make them surrender. Now, actually, another officer that's going to be sent to another important place is P.G.T. Beauregard. I have to tell you, Pensacola and Charleston are the two places where the war could ignite at any time. This is a tinderbox. So you got all these Alabama, Floridian volunteers. They capture the Navy Yard. Navy Yard has a 2-foot-high wall to defend itself. So they just surrender that. So Braxton Bragg works out a deal along with Captain Henry Adams, who's commander of the Sabine. There he is, wow. And here's his ship. And so the Union Navy has several ships, including the Brooklyn, off of Santa Rosa Island, which is where this fort is located. And so they actually have reinforcements to land at Fort Pickens. Well, I have to tell you, Bragg works out a kind of a truce. If you don't land those troops, I won't try to take Fort Pickens, and I won't blockade it, because Bragg, where do they get their food? Well, they got to get it from Pensacola. So this becomes a very hot location. Basically, the need to control Pensacola is a major thing for the Confederacy. If you think about the coast, there is the major Navy Yard. There it happens to be beautiful bay. It's a blockade runner's haven. And so the Union do not want the Federals to be able to take it. Now, Bragg, after Lincoln is elected, is going to actually cut this deal with Adams. And so the ships are just sitting off the fort, doing nothing. The soldiers that came with the Brooklyn, guess what? They're all in the ship, sweltering in the Florida heat, waiting to go do something. Because this informal truce is really just a pause. Kind of like, there was a pause in Charleston Harbor. So basically, the United States says, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. and we have to get a special agent because Henry Adams, who we just saw a picture of, refused the new orders from Gideon Well to land the troops. He says, we got a truce here. And so they have to get him orders. And, you can't just telegraph, Pensacola and say, hey, land your troops, because that message would never have gotten through. So they have to pick someone who they believe is, how could I say, he is said untainted by treason and was possessed of the necessary qualifications for the mission. And so the idea, actually Worden's ordered to Washington, D.C. He gets there on April 8th. He actually will have a midnight meeting with Flag Officer Silas Stringham and Gideon Wells. And Gideon Wells tells him, well, you have to go down and give orders to the commander of the Sabine, who's actually commander of the Pensacola station. And this was a secret, responsible, and somewhat dangerous duty to go through the South. So here's Worden in naval uniform being told, you have to take a train down to Pensacola and somehow get out to where the fleet is and tell them what to do. And so the secretary directed Worden to make no mention of his journey to anyone, not even his wife. The fact that he was an officer of the Navy passing south to Pensacola and yet not a secessionist or in sympathy with them would likely be challenged and perhaps searched. So Worden, that's April 6th. Next day, April 7th, Warden, now he's got these dispatches and he's kind of been told, you're going to have to memorize these, and then if challenged, eat them. So, which he didn't do quite that, but so he hops on a train, and of course, he arrives in Pensacola on April 10, 1861. Now, just remember our timeline here. When do we bombard Fort Sumpter? 16th, I think. No, the 12th. And 12th through the 14th. So everyone in the Lincoln administration is all pulling out their hair. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Gustavus Fox goes to William Seward and says, I want this one ship, the Powhatan, to go down and relieve Fort Sumpter. I'm going to do this with heavy steam tugs, and so we'll save the day. The trouble is, Gideon Wells has plans to use that very same ship to go down to Pensacola and to reinforce Fort Pickens. So this means the Union hasn't figured out how to operate wartime issues. So unfortunately, the most powerful ship in the U.S. Navy at that time, the Powhatan steam screw frigate, is, guess what? Heading to Pensacola instead of Fort Sumpter. Now, I have to tell you, this is a very tense time. And so Worden's on the train, and he recognizes, hey, I got this blue uniform on, and there's all these Confederates. And, so he goes into the water closet, memorizes the message, and then dispose of it. He didn't eat it, but he got rid of it, tore it up, that sort of stuff. And then he went back to his seat and arrives at midnight on April 11th. Let's remember our timeline now. Things are boiling, and so he goes and sees General Bragg, and so he asked Bragg, well, I got some messages to give to Captain Adams. Can I pass through the lines to do so? Bragg allows him to do that. He says, do you have any written dispatches for Captain Adams? And the answer is, no, I don't. Basically, I just got rid of them. And so he says, I have a verbal communication from the department. And so Bragg says, Warden asked Bragg, would he be permitted to land on his return from Santa Rosa Island and go back to Washington? And Bragg says, sure, as long as that Captain Adams or myself, this is Warden speaking, did nothing in violation in the agreement between them. This is his informal troops. The Federals cannot land those troops, otherwise this is virtually war. And Worden then goes out the Wyandotte, a Union steamer, and goes out and meets with Adams and gives him the verbal orders that you're supposed to land these troops. You're supposed to land these troops right away. And once Worden did that, he gets some dispatches from Adams to take back to Washington. He comes back to Pensacola. Now, I got to tell you, this is, ready for this? April 12th. And we're down here in Pensacola. We don't really know what's happening up in Charleston yet. So Bragg, Adams tells Worden, well, look, you don't have to report to Bragg. You just get on that train and head back to Washington. Way back to Washington, you got to take the train to Montgomery and points north from there. So Worden doesn't check in with Bragg. He then hops on the train and goes towards Montgomery. While he's going towards Montgomery, what's going to happen is that the Union troops are landed at Fort Pickens. And so when he reaches Montgomery, there's already orders telegraphed from the Attorney General of the Confederacy, Judah Benjamin. He'll play several different roles and they said, you have violated your agreement with Bragg. In fact, Benjamin said he violated his promise to report to General Bragg, carried into Fort Pickens secret dispatches while he showed General Bragg open dispatches, and further to report himself from returning from Fort Pickens. Worden denied this. He will say, when I wasn't supposed to stop at Bragg's headquarters, and if I had understood what was required of me, I would have done so. Now you got to realize this is a one-way ticket to imprisonment, in essence, because Worden has allowed Pensacola to be saved, and Bragg knows it, Judah Benjamin knows it, and so they will have some Confederate soldiers will come see, Worden's wearing his uniform, so he's conspicuous. They go and capture him, and when they arrive in Montgomery, they take him to the Montgomery City Jail, okay? Boom. So when he arrives there, he'll actually send a letter to Gideon Wells and his wife telling them about his capture. I arrived here on the 13th and detailed well and comfortable, hope to see in a few days. I cannot tell you how long I shall be detained, but I pray you keep good spirits and a cheerful heart, and kiss the little ones for me. Well, so this is the first POW. You got to realize this is amateurs fighting a war at this time. Amateurs in the fact in many cases, they don't know what they're doing. So when you capture someone in other wars, you would exchange them. So there is no exchange system. However, the Confederates have been very cavalier. The soldiers they captured at Fort Sumpter, he said, well, you can hop on a boat and go back north. Don't worry about it. At the Battle of Big Bethel, there were several Federals captured, and Magruder has an argument with Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler, back and forth, I'm a gentleman, you're not, type of stuff, sending barbs. But then they all exchange prisoners. So there is no exchange of prisoners. And Wells will write to Mrs. Worden saying, his conduct has always been of an officer of high standing, and I sincerely regret that at present there appears no way of releasing him. So Worden, and they call him Jack, all his friends, Worden is considered really, oh, this is a hero of the hour. However, we have no power to do anything to have him released. The one person that does have the power to try to get him released is his wife, Olivia Toffee Worden. And she takes it upon herself to start writing letters to everybody she could. She actually asked a friend who was friends with Verina Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, can you send them a letter and ask for them to release my poor husband, who is silently awaiting his doom in the prison of Montgomery. There he is, an officer of the United States Navy whose existence seemed to have been forgotten by his country and his friends. He was one of the most efficient officers in the service. And she closes, he is in prison even though he has bad health, referencing the kidneys, but that he has been confined for simply obeying his orders in good faith entrusted to him by the government. And so, in other words, Olivia is saying, hey, you caused him to go down there into the jaws of death. He did his duty, and now you're not going to do anything to help him. Eventually, she starts to get through to people. Actually, a letter she sends to Mrs. Marcham will be forwarded to John Sherman, Senator of Ohio. And basically, John Warden, now in prison at Montgomery, surely something can be done at once to get Worden released. He is in bad health. Can he be exchanged or his release obtained in some way? He saved Fort Pickens. Government should now save him. Now you can imagine Olivia writing all these letters to everybody she knows, everyone she doesn't know, but she knows they might be able to do everything. So the big issue about Worden's release is going to be there is no exchange system. So I have to tell you about the exchange system. Basically, in prior wars, I capture 10 privates, you capture one of my colonels, I trade 10 privates for a colonel, and so forth. In other words, one-to-one exchange if they're equal rank. And this is a typical thing that happens in Europe. We exchanged prisoners during the War of 1812, so it's not unheard of. It's just that no one sat down and has worked out this concept. And basically, in Hampton Roads, we have the commander of the North Atlantic blockading squadron. There's Gideon Wells, of course. Judah Benjamin, who ordered the arrest of Worden. There is Mrs. Worden, we believe, in this picture. The person with sunglasses on is actually Worden. And this will be taken after the Battle of Hampton Roads. So Worden's best friend, John Augustus Wise, will basically draw this in a sketchbook of Worden in a jail. But I got to tell you, Alexander Wise, I got to tell you that that's not real. Because actually, Worden gets along with the jailer and his wife. Actually, one jailer dies, another one comes in. He actually gets to have dinner with the jailer and his wife. He's actually given freedom to walk around Montgomery, not to leave his, the jurisdiction of Montgomery. Go as you come. Some people will come up to him and says, well, there's some vicious secessionists over there, you better go back. And he records this in a letter where he writes about him being a POW. So Henry Wise is, this is a mythical thing because he becomes involved because his father-in-law used to be Secretary of State. And so everyone's pleading for Worden to be saved because there's these images, right, in the northern mines of prison ships from the Revolutionary War, where prisoners were put on old rotten hulks and left there to have bare existence. And everyone thinks, oh, Worden is going through this difficult imprisonment. But in truth, it is not that difficult. It's unlike any other. He's not in a prison camp, he's in a jail. He has money, so he can pay the jailer for his meals. He sometimes becomes sick, but that's because of his ongoing kidney disease. And so Warden he's not able to write home that often. So, and he doesn't tell anyone about, oh, I get freedom to walk around and so forth. Nevertheless, Olivia is so forthright about what she is doing that she will actually contact Flag Officer Louis Malshibres Goldsborough, commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And I got to tell you, this is a person who gets involved, John Sherman, who is brother to a famous general, he kind of pushes it forward with a couple of other senators. What are we going to do? What can we do? Right? Remember, no exchange cartel has been set up. In fact, there's not a formal exchange cartel set up until spring of 1862. It's called, actually early summer, it's called the Dix Hill Cartel. And that's because Daniel Harvey Hill and John Adams Dix worked out this system of trade. So in command at Norfolk happens to be this man. This man is, of course, Benjamin Huger. There's several ways, I think, to pronounce it. It's not Hugger. That's one thing I know. But sometimes I think it's Hugi, but sometimes, oh, no, it's Hugi. And I'm going, oh, my God. So anyway, the big thing is he's in command of the Department of Norfolk. And actually, there is a truce ship that goes into the middle of Hampton Roads from Norfolk and meets a truce ship from Fort Monroe, and they exchange travelers. Because there's some people trapped in the South who say, well, I'm from New Jersey, I don't have anything, I just want to go back home. And there's some Northerners who says, well, I really support states' rights, and I want to go to South. So there's this constant, and mail is actually crossed there. You think about mail, the Confederacy sets up its own postal service, but they send stuff to New York and whatever. So it's kind of a, remember I said this is a war of amateurs at first. The Battle of Bull Run happens, and it's no longer amateurish because the Federals have been defeated and over 1,000 Union soldiers have been captured. And many of them end up in Libby Prison, an old tobacco warehouse. So the very thought of an old tobacco warehouse reminds people of those prison hulks. And so they're all worried, how can we get our prisoners back? So this is the guy that's really going to, he and Hugi are going to affect the trade between North and South. So actually, Benjamin Hugi will interface with John Ellis Wool. They both know each other from the old army, and they're somewhat friends. And so they start talking about, they have limited prisoner exchanges because there's some action going on after Manassas, especially the capture of Hatteras Inlet, where Lieutenant William Southall Sharp will be captured. Now, Southall Sharp was actually an officer at the Gosport Navy Yard. Of course, when the Union abandoned that, he resigns from the Navy, United States Navy, and joins the Confederate States Navy. He is an aide to Flag Officer Samuel Barron. And Barron is sent down to Hatteras to try and organize the situation there. He arrives too late because Flag Officer Silas Stringham will actually bombard the forts defending the inlet, and the forts are supposed to have to surrender, and Barron becomes a POW along with Sharp. Now, actually, Sharp was a Norfolk native, and he Sharp and Worden know each other. They don't know about this exchange that's hooking up, but they served on board the USS Cumberland during a Mediterranean cruise. And I have to say, this was 1853, 1855. Warden was a lieutenant. William Southall Sharp was a lieutenant, and Sharp was a midshipman. So basically, Goldsboro, with approval from Wool, starts to exchange letters with Benjamin Huger. Now, remember, the Federals, especially a Philadelphia banker named Jay Cook, John Sherman, and another senator will take up this cause. Now, Olivia shared excerpts of a letter he got, and he had been sick, but was again quite well. He writes that he's treated kindly by the jailer's family and by those with whom he comes in contact, but is not allowed parole. He is allowed to mess with the family of the jailer by paying board. So in this particular way, he is comfortable. However, she did not want the government to abandon him. So she writes Goldsboro, says, what can you do? Goldsboro wrote to Mrs. Worden, you may, I confidently think, soon see your husband. I have been working to accomplish his release and only requires one step more. Be of good cheer, he closes. Don't despond. I'm working hard to accomplish the release of your worthy husband, and I think I've almost brought it about. Well, the release does happen on November 13th. Worden is going to be placed on parole. You know, he's going through Norfolk where they're building, transferring the Merrimack into the Virginia, but he's not supposed to talk about anything he sees that would violate his parole. And so basically, he pledged not to serve in any manner, direct or indirectly, against the Confederate States of America until I've been exchanged. Worden left Montgomery on November 14th. He reached Richmond the next day. He goes to the Adjutant General's office. Then he's sent to General Huger. And so Sharp is at Fort Monroe. So basically, they don't see each other, but they are passing basically like in the night, you know. Worden has no clue who he's being exchanged for. Now, so what's going to happen is basically he immediately, Gideon Wells says, hey, great, you're free now, because they got exchanged, and so you need to report to the department right away, in person. But Worden wrote, report immediately to the department in person, but for the last 3 days, I've been feeling the approach of the disease which I suffered last winter greatly, and I therefore deem it most prudent to proceed at once to my home that I may receive the necessary medical treatment under the care of my family. And Wells notes at the bottom of this letter, congratulate him, etc. You know. So Worden then returns to Quaker Hill, where his family is staying, on November 21st. And then by the 3rd of December, Worden writes to the department, I have the honor to inform the department that I have, in obedience with its orders of 2nd December, reported to the commandant of basically the Brooklyn Navy Yard for duty at the U.S. Naval Rendezvous at New York. And he would remain in that position for 1 month. Now, Worden, during his, now just think what he's done so far in the war. He has saved Pensacola from Confederate control. He has also been captured, the first POW of the Civil War, because he becomes a celebrity because of his capture, and oh, how he's suffering. But we know from what Warden says later that no, I didn't really suffer. So by going to the Naval Rendezvous, once again, that's supposed to recruit soldiers or sailors to serve the expanding Navy. But he's only in that position 5 weeks before he receives the letter from Joseph Smith saying, you need to take command of this experimental ship, the Monitor. And so we can see how everyone's attention has grown in an amazing way about who Worden is, a trustworthy officer, a scientific officer, and he, according to Smith, is the perfect type of officer to take command of this new vessel.